Welcome to episode 17 of the Pernicious Chattel channel. I'm XCG, and today we're returning to where I started my journey on YouTube, which is taking a fairly serious look at academic books, at books that are pretty challenging, have some big ideas in them. Can't resist doing it. I think it's something that really interests me. Nonetheless, we have an interesting title today, and I think it gets to the heart of something that's always kind of baffled me, and that is that many of us experience discomfort on a fairly regular basis. Some of it can be quite chronic and quite disabling. Otherwise, if you look at our life from the external perspective, you know, we have a place to live, we have people who love us, we have food, we have clothing, we have everything we need. So what we're told, particularly when we seek mental health treatment, is that we have a disorder, that there must be something fundamentally wrong with us, whether it's how we were brought up, or whether it is our chemical makeup, or whether it's in our genes, or whatever, something fundamentally that's wrong with us. And that's what's causing the disorder, and if we can treat that, then we'll feel better. The mental health field is not the only field that comes to this type of interpretation. So evangelical Christians will tell you that you feel empty and that you feel discomfort because you haven't accepted your Lord and Savior Jesus Christ into your heart, and that will fill you up and make you feel better. Or self-help gurus will say, well, it is because you're not fully actualized, and what you really need to do is to live up to your potential and really drive it, really chase what you're passionate about, and then you'll feel better. Or there's another way of looking at it that might be just as relevant, and that is, maybe what's fundamentally wrong is not us, but the world that we live in. That somehow the world fails us as an individual, or us as a larger group, or us as a segment of population, or us as the majority of the population, in that even doing our best possible in this world, even doing everything that we're told we need to, we still end up ultimately feeling unfulfilled and unhappy and uncomfort and depressed and have trouble paying attention, or we feel anxiety and so on and so on and so on. And that's the point of the book I'm looking at today. So if that's something that also interests you, come on along. I'm critiquing the book Normality Does Not Equal Mental Health: The Need to Look Elsewhere for Standards of Good Psychological Health, written by Steven James Bartlett and published in 2011. I picked up this book entirely based on its title, but hoping to find, among other things, that mental health may be a social construct rather than a purely individual personal experience. And excitingly for me, the first section of the book is powerful, well thought through, and entirely reflective of the title. Unfortunately, and despite this ambitious opening, the book peters out somewhere around the 40% mark. And out of the 4 sections of the book, only the first is actually related to the title. The next 3 are about the purported decline of higher learning, driven by narcissism, materialism, and egalitarianism. I was looking for a well-researched, well-argued academic book that critiqued modern views on mental health, but what I got was in fact an angry, reactionary, conservative opinion piece by a professor clearly bitter about his time teaching. A kind of Fox News in scholars' robes. Our author. Steven James Bartlett, born in 1945, is the author of 20 books and papers in the fields of epistemology, psychology, mathematical logic, and the philosophy of science. He holds a 1971 PhD in philosophy from the Université du Paris, later engaged in postdoctoral study in clinical psychology at St. Louis University from 75 to 77, and at Washington University in St. Louis from 83 to 84. Bartlett served as a professor at the University of Florida, 71-72, University of Hartford, 72-74, was appointed research fellow at the Max Planck Institute in Germany from 74 to 75. He served as a consultant for RAND, National Science Foundation Project in Regional Analysis and Management of Environmental Systems from 75 to 78. He served as a professor at St. Louis University from 75 to 84. He was an associate editor of the Modern Schoolman from 75 to 84. He was a member of the advisory board of the Dutch Journal Methodology and Science from 76 to 95. He was a member of the Global Advisory Board of Human Dignity and Humiliation Studies from 2005 onward. And, finally, he has received honorary faculty appointments at Wilmette University in 88 and Oregon State University also in 88. So, needless to say, he's well respected, he's incredibly well educated, and evidently a very intelligent man. As a result, my pretty much outright contempt for his conclusions are, well, probably a bit unfair, but even more than unfair, potentially dangerous for my reputation, as I wouldn't want to enter into a public debate with this particular professor. He's obviously articulate, he's an excellent communicator, and he's clearly educated and experienced well beyond my level. In other words, I guess I'm going to have to qualify what I say after this by saying he may be a reactionary conservative, and I think the book demonstrates that, but he's a really sophisticated one. A summary of the book. The first section of the book is extremely promising. Bartlett explains and gives examples of how the mental health profession uses observational and experimental research that takes the average human behavior as its basis for good mental health. It also accepts that a lot of egregious human behavior is good mental health. To explain this in a clear example, Bartlett uses the Holocaust, where the majority of Germans at the time accepted passively or participated actively in a horrific and barbaric crime. But modern psychology has interpreted and tested this trend and come to the conclusion that it is simply the nature of a healthy human psychology, that any one of us is prone to following blindly, and each one of us is equally capable of unspeakable cruelty, destructiveness, and evil. The popular phrase attached to this trend is the banality of evil. Our author, Bartlett, convincingly argues that this is actually a dangerous conclusion. He argues that our inquiry should then turn to those outliers who have done differently, the dissenters, the conscientious objectors, the pacifists, and the rebels who stood up against popular society on the basis of their values. This group, Bartlett argues, should be the baseline we use to define mental health. If the average human is violent, destructive, and self-destructive, then we need to be looking elsewhere to find a different, better, and more healthy way of being. He argues we shouldn't say the banality of evil, rather, the evil of banality. Being average, being mediocre, being banal does not equate to an attractive form or an aspirational form of mental health. Bartlett then goes on to dissect the development and use of the DSM, Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. This manual guides psychiatrists in diagnosing mental disorders. Bartlett explains how these diagnoses are based on a grouping of symptoms, not on a conclusive pathology. To oversimplify, let's say you're tired and you have a headache. You observe that condition is a common one for you and for many others. As a result, based on these facts, you conclude that there is an illness called headachy sleepiness. Obviously, most people would say that that is nonsense. These symptoms could indicate that you have caught one of a number of viruses, or you could be hungover, or you're simply tired and stressed. In many cases, this is exactly what the disorders in the DSM are. A much more rigorous, but no more accurate, symptom-based hypothesis of what mental disorders exist. We don't know what, or even if, actual biomechanical malfunctions or pathogens are causing these particular symptoms. Bartlett does a fantastic job of using many sources to show how the DSM is full of essentially primitive placeholders for disorders. It's a good guide, as long as we understand the limitations. Unfortunately, in the case of many psychiatrists, insurance companies, authorities, and the general public, we don't use mental disorders this way. We treat them as defined diseases. To further elaborate on why this is important and what consequences might be, Bartlett dedicates a chapter to creative people. This is a topic that he clearly understands and gives enormous thought. We know conclusively that creative people suffer from significantly more mental distress, are more likely to be diagnosed with disorders, and are much more likely to self-harm or commit suicide. What is not clear is why, and how does that causality work? Does suffering cause people to be more creative, or does the act of creating cause suffering? Bartlett suggests that a third option is possible. Highly creative and highly sensitive people who aspire to great feats of creativity suffer because they live in a society and they live in conditions that don't suit them. They suffer because they fit uncomfortably in their world. Obviously, the implication is, if we value human creativity, then we shouldn't pathologize creative people, but pathologize how our society sickens them. Drawing on these above conclusions, Bartlett proposes that many modern health issues are not bad mental health, but simply a growing number of people who suffer because the world we have created is unsuitable for good mental health. People suffer because human needs don't fit society's values. He uses the term acedia to label his new category of disorder. This disorder is, in Bartlett's argument at least, a conditions of values disability. Our work-obsessed, materialistic, overly busy, and shallow way of life has squeezed out and devalued the spiritually sustaining pursuit of more noble human endeavors. So he argues that ADD, or depression, or anxiety, and in most cases our burnout, are not mental health disorders themselves, but in fact symptoms of people not engaging in non-productive noble pursuits. For him, these noble pursuits are found in transforming the way we view the world through myth, art, music, and abstract theoretical research. In other words, we are spiritually starving and we need the sustenance of artistic creativity, of artistic appreciation, and of intellectual challenge. At this point, at about 33% of the book, Bartlett starts heading off from mental health into a much more specific topic. He begins to apply his conclusions exclusively to the modern conditions within universities and academia. Higher education in Bartlett's analysis is in decline, as universities have expanded to accommodate more people from all classes and races, and their focus has been shifted to creating workers ready to participate in the materialistic consumption ethic. There are too many quote-unquote mediocre students going to university for the wrong reasons, without a passion, and looking for the easiest way through university. This has led to worse and less demanding courses, the burnout of professors, and much more mediocre universities. This is not framed just as an example, but seems to be Bartlett's singular focus and the prime issue he identifies. Bartlett writes, quote, "An American education is controlled by an egalitarian distortion of democracy that flattens individual differences and glosses over distinctions. American family life is driven by the themes of money and career. They feed parental narcissism, which widens the emotional distance to children who are raised in an atmosphere of neglect and permissiveness. Family discipline and its social equivalent in the justice of the courts are fumbling affairs of leniency rationalized as tolerance. Caught in this web of laxity, indiscrimination, and materialism, the young, by the time they are ready to enter college, have established within themselves a mental fixity born of fear and disorientation that is strikingly narcissistic, and in its monadic self-encapsulation, in its fear and resentments of authority, and in its conformist rigidity and intellectual lassitude. The result is the high-tech barbarian, rude without appreciation for culture, crude in his taste, raucous in his behavior, enthralled by the loud pulse of his music, and devoted to the accumulation of megabucks and the amassment of the shining baubles of tawdry affluence. So, Bartlett, tell us how you really feel. Bartlett believes that democratic attitudes have led to an elevated sense of mediocrity as good. Egalitarianism gone mad, and the exceptional no longer has any special value. As a result, we eschew any form of elitism, even if elitism is a result of superior skills, extensive effort, and the accumulation of intellectual or artistic prowess. In the process, we have dumbed down our universities and elevated these barbarians, these cruel, unruly, narcissistic, and immoral mob. Bartlett's solution, then, is to return to a recognition of excellence, to recognizing authority, to greater enforcement and less permissiveness, and to recognize that individual responsibility must supersede a belief that social or environmental causes explain the failure of individual men. As this diagnosis is primarily focused on universities and higher education, it is difficult to say how we would necessarily apply this to the overall framework of broader society, but what is clear is that he would admit a smaller group of proven students in universities that were much more rigorous and demanding. Those students and the wider society would be required to hold education and graduates of these institutions in much higher esteem. As well, utilitarian interests, such as the needs of the job market, would be discarded as the motivation and objective of universities. Rather, universities focus on higher values. Utility of outcome wouldn't be as important as the grand aspirations, scientific ambition, and the purely theoretical intellectual pursuits of academics. Critique. I really enjoyed and was excited by the ideas presented in the first 30% of the book, but as I went into sections 2 and 3, I found myself increasingly disagreeing with this author. Unfortunately, the book makes a number of poorly substantiated logical leaps, and it reaches conclusions that are unsupported as a result. The book outlines large conceptual notions. First, how mental health is understood and treated. Secondly, how society is highly materialistic and shallow. Then it applies these notions specifically to universities in a way that I believe underestimate the problem, and at the same time overestimates the importance of universities. I'm unsure of how a better university or universities would necessarily change broad and entrenched social problems. Certainly theoretical research and philosophical ideas don't change the world in the short term, no matter how significant in the longer term. I'm also unclear how a purportedly mentally ill society would support these institutions. While the book is excellent and inspiring at some points, unfortunately, I suspect the book is mostly a single university professor's magnificent editorial on why his vocation and the institutions he served are so frustrating and uninspiring. Ultimately, he dislikes popular culture and what it has done to a system he values. And he detests the barbarian students and how universities accommodate them. I want to like this book because I think its criticisms of modern mental health practices are extremely interesting, point out huge issues, and give us a great lever to reevaluate what mental health means. It is a powerful use of deconstruction. The notion that mental health is primarily defined by normalcy is a fact that is very open to attack. I'm intrigued by the idea that current normal society suffers from a type of mass delusion, and what we define as normal mental health is in fact disturbed. We've been conditioned from childhood to accept our society as it is. But to adapt to a disturbed society is very problematic. You can either be sane and a weirdo, or you can be insane and be normal. He quotes Louis Bisque to humorously illustrate the point. Quote, "What this country needs is not more normals, not even exceptionally fine ones, but more neurotics. Neurotics who are glad of it. Neurotics who have had the courage to stress their individuality and sensitiveness and make it outstanding and telling." Bish was not afraid of political incorrectness. He boldly claimed, "To be normal is nothing to brag about. When I study normals and compare them with neurotics, I wonder sometimes whether to be normal is not something to be ashamed about." We might be reminded of the definition of abnormal given by Ambrose Bierce. "Not conforming to standard in matters of thought and conduct, to be independent is to be abnormal. To be abnormal is to be detested." And his definition of mad: affected with a high degree of intellectual independence, not conforming to the standards of thought, speech, and action. Close quote. But it's exactly at this point where Bartlett goes quite off the rails. He starts by asserting a new type of mental distress that he labels acedia. Acedia was a term used by medieval scholars to describe spiritual laziness. I can follow this hypothetical causal link. Consumer culture is shallow and empty. But humans are more than just shallow, so sensitive people are experiencing distress, acedia. But he doesn't actually establish this causal link beyond his hypothesis. Neither does he provide specific support for mental distress being an outcome of materialism, although there is research supporting this link. His only support for the concept comes from the original usage of the word acedia. Moreover, he doesn't show how the current mental health diagnosis system creates or spreads shallowness and laziness. He is probably implying that being misdiagnosed undermines treatment and normalizes bad behavior. But this isn't a direct causal agent. Our current crisis of disorders could be caused by our shallow culture, but diagnosis didn't create the disorder in the first place. You need to be in distress before you can be diagnosed. Acedia as a condition is also not well supported in Bartlett's argument. He does prove that acedia was a condition that medieval scholars believed in, and he does reasonably establish that you could logically associate the symptoms of acedia with the sorts of conditions we are seeing amongst the average person in North America. But acedia doesn't necessarily explain those conditions any better than competing explanations. So as a hypothesis, it has some merit, but as a basis for future action, it is pretty weak. Likewise, he has taken acedia out of its original religious context and given it a completely new focus: secular, higher values. To my mind, this is a very questionable use of the concept. I don't think a medieval scholar would have considered appreciation of the visual arts to be somehow spiritual. Those associations are a purely modern idea. In fact, the idea that we could use quote-unquote high culture to replace the values of Christianity as an exhortation to community cohesion came out of a concern with increasing atheism of the modern period. This idea is also only a hypothesis in itself, first proposed by 19th century artists. High culture may not be a valid substitute for religious experience. Obviously, based on my most recent series of videos linked above, I agree with Bartlett that materialism and capitalism are indeed creating mental health issues. I can even accept the possibility that these issues are similar to what medieval scholars were observing when using the word acedia. I think that this explanation does dovetail nicely into some more recent research into mental distress and modern society. But I am not at all convinced the cure is high culture, especially when he goes on to imply that only the elite can truly pursue high culture. At that point, we've entered into a choke point. Mental health is the treatment of emotional distress and the issues it causes. If that distress is a result of bad fit between our culture and human values, then why would the cure only be accessible to a small elite? Is this not merely abandoning of the majority? Besides, if the elite suffer because of their outlier status, then codifying that elite status and excluding the majority doesn't fundamentally change the outcome. You still have a small group of super intelligent, sensitive people living in a culture of barbarians. Unless, of course, he's suggesting some sort of elite segregation? Finally, as an example of how our current society is damaging inherently valuable institutions, universities are great. I agree that universities are not primarily technical training schools. They were never intended to turn out a legion of businessmen whose only vocation was the accumulation of wealth. As public sentiment, government funding, and business interests have increasingly pushed universities to focus on turning out good little workers, it has led to universities becoming something completely different. I'm perfectly happy with an argument asserting universities are much worse as a result. It doesn't strain my credulity to believe on average university graduates are not especially well educated nor able to fully utilize their rational capabilities. After all, we've all run into a well-educated idiot. But there seems to be a belief somehow mental health disorders and treatment are contributing to this change. And that simply isn't substantiated in Bartlett's argument. I fail to see how correcting mental health diagnosis would provide anything other than a very weak impetus for society change, or how it would directly assess the purported university crisis. There are clear parallels, and I see potential connections between the two, but I suspect only because mental health practitioners and universities both exist in symbiosis with a wider society. Of course they're both shaped by that society. If we wanted to change one, we need to change the other. We would need to abandon the capitalist ethos altogether. If everything's about money and money is dependent on economic growth, then encouraging consumption is a necessary component. Promoting shallow values and consumption is inevitable. If promoting shallow values and consumption is inevitable, then you're going to end up with a society mainly made up of Bartlett's barbarians. These barbarians will also control the money you need to build and maintain your university, and the cycle continues. What are my conclusions? This is where I believe that Bartlett is really only expressing an opinion based on his own experience, and not actually creating a robust recommendation. His response to the issues he identifies is to return to a system of more clearly defined classes, based on elites, the well-educated, the creative, and the intellectually active, and everyone else. He also would like a return to valuing authority, and while not saying it, it would seem to be implied that these elites would be the aforementioned authorities. Finally, he would like to see this system enforced in some way, and that enforcement includes ensuring the elites are accorded the respect and deference they deserve. So let me summarize. Professors are elite. Universities are the exclusive enclave of these elites. These elites get both prestige and authority. Have I mentioned that Dr. Bartlett is a professor? Unfortunately, Dr. Bartlett is trying to hit a fly with a nuclear bomb and has somehow managed to completely miss. He is providing a criticism of modern society that essentially calls into question the entire view of mental health and what normal even means. This view is the opposite of what any mainstream view of the world would assert. It's revolutionary. But in successfully criticizing modern society, he then focused on universities without ever pointing out how wider society could or would change. He didn't need 30% of his book to make the points if he was only focused on university. But once he makes the argument, he can't then say, but let's change post-secondary academia and let the rest of the society sort itself out. It's like trying to fix starvation by providing more stoves. Stoves are a great tool, but food is the key ingredient. I'm afraid my verdict on this book is a solid 2 out of 5 stars. It has some highlights, but mostly it is just a bitter, older man's rant. This book is the psychological equivalent of climate denialism. Science is imperfect, it oversimplifies, it's full of assumptions, and we don't grasp the full complexity. So, we may have made large mistakes in climate science, and the results of global warming could be different than we expect. But those issues don't give you the right to apply whatever hypothesis you prefer. You still need to put in the research to support your assertions. You still need to use your hypothesis responsibly. Unfortunately, Professor Bartlett has given into temptation, and his book has suffered as a result. So thanks so much for sticking with me today through this very long and perhaps a little bit pedantic video that I just produced. I certainly appreciate your viewership and you being part of my audience. If you liked what you saw, please feel free to subscribe and hit the thumbs up. I appreciate that very much, as does the YouTube algorithm. Next video I'm going to do is actually take my own take on these ideas presented by Bartlett and try and take them somewhere that I think is more meaningful in terms of what we should be pursuing as a society. Hope you join me then. Regardless though, I personally am wishing you all speed and success on your journey to freedom.